Welcome back to the High Tech Forum podcast. This is episode 54. Today I'm joined by Stacie Hoffman and Dominique Lazanski, who have written a really intriguing paper called Standardizing the Splinternet, How China's Technical Standards Could Fragment the Internet. They both work at the Oxford Information Labs in Oxford, England, of course, where Stacie is specializes in digital policy and cybersecurity, and Dominique is, in addition to her work at Oxford at OXIL, director of LastPass Label in London, and I take it you might have some interest in piracy and that sort of intellectual property rights. Generally, it's a good topic. Too bad we can't talk about it today in any depth. So welcome, ladies. And by the way, Stacie this is her second appearance. She was on the High Tech Forum podcast last August discussing DNS over HTTPS DOE, Google's attempt at essentially subverting the integrity of the DNS. That hadn't really worked out for him, has it?
Not so well, no. It's actually a good case study related to what we're going to talk about. So.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. It occurs to me that a good way to approach this discussion is to begin with the recommendations and then let you explain why you think that's important. So let's start with the first one. You say like-minded countries should create a strategic standards group for the sharing of information, discussion on approaches to global standards making, and analysis of forthcoming standards. The SSG should leverage stakeholder expertise, including industry, academia, and civil society, to build capacity and coordination, which basically says to me, we need to take the standards development process more seriously.
Absolutely. I think for us in the US and UK and in the West, standards are industry-led, right? Because they're practical, they're able to be used. And as I think you've mentioned recently on one of your other podcasts, there's often a lot of fights to do with standards.
Oh, yeah.
But the other thing is, because of the industry-led approach to standards in Western countries, governments don't participate as much. And so the idea behind this first point is almost like what I now call an S10 or a standards 10, comparable to like a G7 or some, something like that, basically. And that is to share information so that people are aware when certain governments don't attend or certain governments do attend, and the capacity is shared among governments and all stakeholders effectively, without one person doing all the work.
Yeah, I think to that, I would just add that it's really important to understand the interplay between technology and kind of policy and our daily lives. And before technology, if you were talking about a telephone system, right, when the ITU was developing standards and telecommunications in that area, it was fairly basic, but now technology is touching every part of our life, and it's touching on internet governance as well. So governments really need to understand what's going on and be able to horizon scan and understand the technology that's coming down the path.
Well, and a lot of companies and probably some governments pay consultants to just report to them what's going on in the standards committees, because oftentimes the work is not completely transparent. I mean, there are a lot of documents that are produced, I know, by IEEE 802 that you can't get access to unless you're a member of the committee. That's, because it's in progress stuff, and they don't want people to get the wrong idea about what they're really up to, because oftentimes, especially early in the development of a standard, the committees will consider many different approaches, and then it's kind of a winnowing down process, and to where ultimately you kind of arrive at two, and then you merge the best features together and discard the shortcomings. So that probably doing that in a more open way.
Definitely. That's definitely part of it. It's, the coordination shouldn't just be at the government level. Governments should be interacting with all of the stakeholders. So that includes industry, academia, other experts, human rights experts even. There's a lot of work going on around human rights and standards at the moment.
Hmm.
So they really should be not only coordinating amongst themselves, which is really important to have a unified message and approach to upcoming standards, which is one of the key takeaways of the paper, but also in leveraging and reaching out to their stakeholders and hopefully getting some calls to action that way too.
Well, one of the issues you highlight in the paper is the fact that many standards organizations are what you call multi-stakeholder, like ICANN and IETF are multi-stakeholder. IEEE 802 is like that as well. But then there are others like ITU is more of it's multilateral. So it's actually forming agreements among states, like the standards that are produced by the technical standards committees that I'm most familiar with are just everyone is nobody's actually there officially representing a company, although somebody paid for your ticket.
Yeah.
But you are supposed to be acting in your capacity as a technologist and essentially serving the public interest. And these treaty organizations that China seems to prefer to work with, it's a completely different vibe there, isn't it?
It is, and I think we have to look at the history of the International Telecommunications Union. In addition to working on Spectrum, which again you talked about it on your last podcast, the design was to agree between states, right, for telecommunication interconnection and termination costs. And that's before there was liberalization of telecommunications, primarily in the West again. And so if you look at that history, it makes sense, let's say pre-1988, where you have government to government negotiating. Now, of course, the US basically stood outside that and was like, we'll be there, but we'll do our own thing in terms of termination costs. But then after 1988 is when you started to see the usefulness, I would say, of that multilateral process declining. And that's the difference. Now everything is open in terms of participation. You're right about closed documents. ISO and IEC both are also standards organizations that notoriously are difficult to see what's going on or what's in process. But the other point we make in this particular paper is one of the reasons why China and Chinese companies are focusing on ISO, IEC, or UN agencies is because that gives them access to trade. So the trade barriers through WTO agreements allow for those particular three groups that are standards to be traded. So the idea, for example, is if, let's say, a company like Huawei has a particular thing that they can standardize, then they will be able to have more access to trade than, for example, in the IETF, which is messy and multi-stakeholder and a bit, kind of bottom up.
Well, your intellectual property is more valuable if it's necessary. Standards essential patents that are implicated in trade, and people don't really have much choice but to use them. And IETF doesn't really deal with that many. That's IPR is not such a big deal for them as it is in some other areas.
Sure.
I'm struck by a little bit of irony here, because one of the themes when I was working with the World Economic Forum, one of the themes on technology and geopolitics was this is a couple of years ago. So there was a concern that China was kind of creating parallel institutions to things like the World Bank and the WTO, and sort of bringing in their client states in the developing, especially in the developing world. And the fear was that, this structure they were creating was sort of an alternate globalization model would undermine, the fundamental institutions that are, let's face it, were created by the West and primarily, serve our interests, but have also, I think, arguably been enormously beneficial to the rest of the world. So it sounds like China's not doing that as much. They've just decided to go ahead and subvert our core institutions. Is that pretty much what's going on here?
That's definitely part of it. You can see, and there's a lot of writing right now about how much China is involved in the UN generally, not only the ITU, which is a specialized agency that works on telecommunications. So you can really see how they are trying to use some of their power, their softer power to influence these institutions and have them work in a way that's beneficial to them. Because although they have developed their own, development banks and things like that to support the development work that they do on the Belt and Road Initiative, it also benefits them greatly to work within the global trade and marketplace that is already set up. And so that's really what their drive for intellectual property is. They're one of the biggest claimants of intellectual property now. That's what their drive is, to have really key positions in organizations like the ITU, where they can influence the working methods, where they can give it more steer and direction, where it's supposed to be member states who are, member states financially back the ITU, member states are what the ITU is there to serve. But really, when you hold those key positions, like Zhao does at this time, you can really influence and kind of predetermine the direction that you want that organization to go. So they're definitely taking their opportunities that come to them to influence not only the communication sector, but also the UN more generally and other organizations as well.
And so China's gotten really good at playing geopolitics. They understand
Yes.
that these multilateral organizations, like they're basically they come down to a lot of conflicts between coalitions. So they're the leader of their coalition, and if we're going to counter that, then we need to form coalitions with other freedom-minded liberal democracies, and to get our agenda the kind of visibility and the success that it needs. Okay, so recommendation number 2, like-minded stakeholders should work together to create and amplify a unified approach and cohesive message related to the benefits of the one free and open internet for users, innovators, and government. So that's kind of what we were talking about just now, but more specifically goes to the question of internet architecture, which plays a big part in your paper. I mean, I think you guys are probably motivated by the fact that, well, it's Splinternet's in the title, that China has floated this proposal to ITU-T, I suppose, and to IETF, and is socializing it in other standards development organizations, SDOs. I like that acronym. That would fundamentally alter the organization of functions within the internet. I mean, and this is kind of like, if you're a techie standards geek like I am, this is part of the daily vocabulary, right? Like the 7-layer model. And I can even tell you who invented it and where, what, and who appointed him to the job where he invented it. I mean, but they're collapsing layer 2 and layer 3 into a common layer. What that means is that, well, what does that mean specifically, Dominique? What are the implications of that?
I mean, there's lots of implications. I mean, I think just from a top level, just before we get to the details, the internet right now, how it's built, without getting too techie, relies on best effort, and it's decentralized, right? Mm-hmm. So if I send an email to Stacie, it's going to get there however it's going to get there. I think the important thing and the important language that's being used when describing this technology is that it's guaranteed a quality of service and low latency. Mm-hmm. So there's a guaranteed delivery. So it sounds like a bit like telecommunications again, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean that's basically 3GPP stuff. I mean, when you're doing voice, you need low latency and you need a guaranteed delivery. Well, it doesn't have to be guaranteed, but it should be a high success rate. Maybe it's more critical than, say, streaming video from Netflix. I mean,
exactly. But again, they're just saying, we're done with this best effort. We need to guarantee quality of service, which brings in a whole number of other issues that we could bring up. But I also think it's important to understand that how the internet is built today, and with the advent of 5G, things will be pushed to the edge, pushed to the cloud anyway. And you will have, identifiers and sort of non-TCP/IP non-internet structure, probably at the edge, probably by private companies. But what this fundamentally does is shift all of the architecture that way. And effectively as well, it uses a decentralized model, which effectively uses a blockchain or distributed ledger to ensure that an identifier or piece of information relating to the travel of communications gets from A to B with certain privacy. Now, the irony, which you mentioned earlier, is that basically the way that they're describing blockchain is that it's breakable, it's accessible, and it would adhere to the Chinese law that requires all companies and all information to be able to be accessed by the government.
Well, I mean, they're using blockchain to create backdoors.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah. So it's the universal key. It's like going back to the old clipper chip thing, right?
Yes, that's true.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the government, can get access
that's
to
a key
everything.
part.
Excuse me?
Exactly. I mean, that's a key part of it, is that they use language. It's almost like double speak. So they'll say decentralized, and they're calling this the decentralized internet infrastructure. And so they're putting out this idea that it's going to be more equal or somehow more decentralized than the current internet. But really, you're looking at the blockchain layer, which is, you were talking about them merging layers 2 and 3. They're calling it the blockchain layer. That would actually put control in the hands of governments, because it's about how that technology, blockchain or DLT, is implemented. And it's going to be implemented in a way such that somebody owns the technology, somebody will decide what the permissions and the parameters are of access to that information. And so it's completely different than how we think of blockchain or the type of, cryptocurrency type implementations that we see
Okay,
now.
so this is one of those models where to access the network, you essentially have to get permission.
Exactly.
And you ask the carrier for permission, you tell them what you want to do, and then then by the time you're doing it, they know what they need to know. I mean, a good part, or how to collect the rest of the info. So,
and they can then track your device, or they could track a piece of information that's on the internet as well. So they could track or block, right, if they don't think you should have access.
And the thing that's happening down there in layer 2 is that you have persistent identifiers.
Exactly. I was just going to say, so the resource management is compressed. There's no such thing as DCHP, where you renew and release, or you're taking your phone from one network to the other, which adds resilience and obviously allows for best effort currently. But yeah, you have to have a persistent identifier. And for me, that is a massive security single point of failure, potentially.
Well, I mean, this is something like a MAC address, which is kind of burned into the hardware. I mean, you can program your way around it if you're pretty skilled. But for example, a MAC address, which is embedded in the IPv6 address, and China requires, they want people to use IPv6, right? I mean, it has large enough address that you can embed whatever persistent identifier you can associate with a person. So essentially what goes away is anonymity.
Exactly.
And of course, you can make really good social responsibility arguments for getting rid of anonymity on the internet, because trolls suck, and maybe people will be more polite if you know who they are, and there's some accountability, and there's a lot of, there's all kinds of, the internet serves the full spectrum of humanity, so obviously there's going to be the full spectrum of behavior taking place on the internet, and some stuff that you see on the internet that really can't happen in real life. So, gosh.
But I think that's a key element, particularly in what we're looking at in the second recommendation, is that there is a lot of not great things that happen on the internet, and there are a lot of problems that we all know about. There is some consolidation happening. There are privacy issues, and right now, internet governance forums and standards development organizations really try to steer clear of those difficult discussions, when what China is basically offering is their own solution to those issues. And in essence, that solution is going to break the structure that we have now, the current internet architecture. So those institutions that we want to reinforce through the second recommendation, we really need to start taking on those harder questions front on and start addressing them in a way that's open, that's multi-stakeholder, that is technologically within the bounds of the structure that we have today for the internet.
And
Well, oh, go ahead.
just on, just on that point, I mean, I think that the approach to governance reflects the approach to, governing within government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that's really quite key to this whole thing. It's an obvious, issue when you look at it, but basically they're trying to effectively change the governance of the internet as well, and the institutions and the language and the social sort of makeup around it, reflective of a top-down nature of their particular type of government.
Well, have we in the West created an opening or an opportunity for China to impose this new architecture on the internet by perhaps not being as diligent as we might have been in addressing shortcomings in the internet architecture that we've been kind of living with for a long time? I mean, for example, you brought up quality of service. I mean, there are applications that really need quality of service, right? I mean, voice and the video chat we're doing right now with if the jitter and latency gets out of bounds, this won't work, right? That's why you see the stutters and people dropping out and stuff, and you need HD voice. I mean, there are vehicle to vehicle, the 5G stuff with extremely low latency. I mean, there are apps that need that. And it's actually provided for in the internet architecture or the internet standard, in IETF standard, diffserv and intserv integrated services. The 5G, 3GPP concept of quality of service builds on integrated services, bearers, and that have different characteristics and all that. And that leads to network slicing in 5G. So, I mean, it's not a bad thing to have that. And it's also probably not a bad thing to, I don't know, when you get into the issues about accountability and anonymity and all that, to me, these aren't really technical questions as much as they're social policy questions. I mean, we have more free and open societies in the West than China does. We don't, I mean, the social credit system they have, there's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like George Orwell. I mean, dude, this is like sort of classic boogeyman stuff in the West, right? But is it sort of is it legitimate in any way for countries like China that simply have different values than we do to promote technologies that protect their own values? And how do you harmonize that?
It is legitimate for them to promote their own values, right? And that's what you do when you go to develop standards, whether you're an industry, a company, or whether you're a member state at the ITU, you're going to make sure that whatever the international standard is that's being developed reflects the values that you have and the needs that you have. I think for me, the big part is that these standards that China is proposing are not being taken to the appropriate forums, and that their proposal is to create a different architecture that will have the option of interconnecting with the internet that we know and use today. So, if they had taken the what they call new IP proposal to the ITF and socialized it there and got the experts that work on internet protocols to really discuss and talk about, do we need to update and change the internet, the core internet protocol, I think that I would have taken it much more seriously than I do now. Not that I don't take the proposal seriously, but that they're proposing it in the ITU, which, as you said, is multilateral. And so they're looking for a place to create an alternate, not only an alternate standard, an alternate internet, but an alternate governance forum that will then control that technology from the point in which it was created into the future iterations of that technology. So instead of going back to the ITU as we would to fix or modify a current standard, they'll be going continually back to the ITU to do that instead.
I also think they're taking advantage of some of the challenges that we've had at both the Internet Society and ICANN, right? Challenges of leadership, challenges of organization, without going into too much detail, there's been quite a lot of member and community discussion and issues over the years. And I think,
well, yeah, I mean, the sale of the
yeah,
of .org, yeah, that,
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that's just the most recent saga, I think, for lack of a better word. It's my personal opinion that that basically China is like, we're done with the ICANN, we don't want to deal with it, and that's part of it, right?
mm-hmm.
They don't want to have to be able to go to the GAC, which is the government meeting of ICANN, and they don't want to have to negotiate in a way that's uncomfortable because it's not multilateral. And I do think basically they will deploy whatever networks they're going to deploy, okay,
Mm-hmm.
in China. That's true. And in Western China, where they have the Uyghurs, they've already been, using technology for tracking, whether it's facial recognition or associating an ID with an individual. All of that, they've been doing that. Obviously violating human rights, and absolutely in an outrageous way, which didn't even show up in the Human Rights Council agenda this time around. But the fact of the matter is they're still going to get on doing that. Now, the question is, as Stacie said, how much of it is going to be internationalized, right?
Well, I mean, traditionally, we haven't really counted on technologies to force good behavior on the part of governments, right? I mean, the way China's internet works today is very different from the way the internet works in the West. I mean,
Yeah.
so the role of standards is, I've always thought of it as, well, it allows China to be China, and the US to be the US, and the UK to be the UK. And also allows all of these jurisdictions to exchange data and applications with each other. So it's just at a technical level, it permits considerable freedom in terms of, social and political and economic policies. But the role of the network is to ensure that that things are roughly interoperable. It's not the role of the network to make us all act like China, or even to make us all act like the US, right?
It's very.
But I mean, this sounds to me like it's moving in a direction where when you have multilateral agreements to use particular protocols that are by their nature insecure and problematic, that no, I mean, this is kind of forcing us all to more or less, I mean, our American, public safety actors going to be able to resist the temptation of snooping on people when there's a back door,
Right.
built into every transaction that today would be relatively secure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other issue that it brings up is, I attend the IETF, and how uncomfortable most technical engineers are about politics, right?
Mm-hmm,
There's
mm-hmm.
always been a separation, and over the last, let's say, 10 years, it's been coming closer and closer together. And so the architecture, or revisiting the email protocols, which is something that's currently being bantered around, not the actual the revisiting of it, but thinking about revisiting it.
Well, that must make Dave Crocker happy.
I know. Which is a whole funny thing, because it's so complicated, and yet no one wants to make it more, more modernized.
Yeah.
But I am, but
we all
instead of
invented email, didn't we?
I know. It's so funny. You're thinking about the geopolitics of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it a lot of people who think about a lot about securing DNS and securing, the architecture, really uncomfortable, and to the point where people are like, that's not what I'm going to focus on. I don't want to deal with that kind of thing, which is good, but it's also, it makes it more difficult to take in both sides.
So I guess what we're saying here is that we need to keep on moving the internet protocols forward, to keep improving them, and to do that in an open way, and to do that without sort of building in obvious traps, the way that I think effectively China wants us to put landmines inside the protocol stack. So that's not good. Okay, recommendation number 3, like-minded stakeholders should work together to promote the adoption of best practices and internationally recognized standards. Like-minded governments in particular may play a role in identifying, promoting internationally recognized standards, and or those standards which have not been formally recognized, or which may contain concerning content identified by allies. I feel like an auctioneer So
Quite a loud
what am I bid for this, for the explanation of this recommendation?
one.
Go for it, Dominique. You were on.
To do it. Well, I have to bring up an issue because Stacie and I haven't mentioned it yet. We originally were accepted to the NATO conference. This paper was accepted to a NATO conference, and so the goals, the last four proposals, were actually geared towards NATO being one of potentially a location or a centralized place to do this. And then suddenly NATO turned around towards the end of the editing process and said, no, we're not going to do it anymore. And we don't know why. We think it has to do with some political nature of engagement with China and various other things. And this happened in March or April, maybe April actually. And therefore this paper is being published as we mentioned in the Chatham House Cyber Journal instead. So the point is that this was geared towards actually thinking about how to stand firm, not just in standards organizations, but sort of more generally in a lot of the committees that are meeting in the UN in New York, where China and Russia and their allies are bringing proposals to have a cyber treaty, which sounds good if you think about it, but is really bad because it allows for a definite in scope and out of scope for cyber acting and cyber combat and cyber engagement in that way. And so basically that's where this is coming from. We really just want to be able to have and say we need to do what effectively the UK and US and Canada have started to do, which is naming and shaming through attribution of all cyber attacks. That's a huge change in the last 2 to 3 years. And this is sort of a knock-on evolution of that.
It's a good point. Naming and shaming. I mean, if we do enough of that, we don't really have to worry too much about counterattacking. I mean, when I was at American Enterprise Institute for a while, and they had a cyber program going on. One of the ideas that they were promoting was that when you get attacked by some foreign actor, you ought to be able to attack back.
Yeah.
And you get into the attribution problems. So like, you think you've been attacked by North Korea, but really you've been attacked by, some Russian mafia.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, how do you know? I mean, but yeah, I think just accountability. I mean, when you make these things public, shaming actually works pretty well in some cultures. I mean, there's some cultures where people are acutely aware of their reputation and very concerned about face saving. So yeah, that could actually work. The trouble I've always noticed when you're working with defense people is that the defense establishment is so hierarchical that the people that go to the meetings and do the negotiation aren't necessarily the most clued into the technology. That's like some junior person that's like 14 levels down the hierarchy. And so I think they do tend to, sometimes there's some really brilliant technology people in the Pentagon and in the defense establishment in the US, but there's also an awful lot of overhead. But anyway, that's off to the side. So essentially we need to develop best practices and work together to get these things incorporated into international standards, and don't let the process be subverted, and don't let it just serve one interest. I mean, it should sort of serve the global interest. And
exactly,
I guess
you can, when you do this, you can promote how these standards are addressing some of the issues that we've talked about today. Whether it's a technical security issue or whether it's a more of a policy, privacy issue, right? You can use that, and you can start to then create another dialogue that's happening alongside the dialogue that the Chinese delegates in standards institutions are putting out today, saying that everything is broken and we need to completely restructure the internet from the bottom up, right? So that kind of goes into that.
Well, I mean, I've actually said that before. But it's just, okay, it's an observation that anyone can make, that any technology could be different. I mean,
Yeah.
Exactly.
there some of the features of the internet are like really essential to the overall mission, and some of them are just historical accidents.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very true.
And if you could identify the unnecessary historical accidents or move them from, well, but actually a lot of times those things play a good role, because when you're designing a technology standard, you don't, at the very beginning, I mean, face it, what you're doing is you're involved in the creation of the technology.
Yep.
And you
That's
don't
true.
know what it's going to be used for, down the road. I mean, when we first developed Wi-Fi, I started working on it in 1990. The target was like point of sale cash register stuff where with wireless scanners and departmental computers that had, that were like had Apple Talk type local area networks where a couple, maybe a dozen people shared a printer and a file server. I mean, the internet, in 1990, the internet wasn't even a thing. I mean, outside of academia. And look at it now. It's like people are using Wi-Fi to provide internet service to farms, you
It's
know,
crazy.
and
Yeah.
running a signal that we specified to go 300 feet. They're extending it to like miles,
It's
and
unbelievable.
it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you just don't know.
By the way, it's all survived this
Yeah,
COVID lockdown where everyone's working at home,
yeah,
and
yeah.
streaming, Netflix quite a lot.
So the final recommendation is nice and short. Like-minded government should coordinate with stakeholders, including industry, academia, and civil society. And you make a special point of including human rights defenders and other experts in strategy development and execution. I mean, to me, this is like if I could change one thing in the world today, the thing that I would change is the tendency of governments to view the technology industry and the services that depend on the technology industry as like hostile actors. I
Yeah.
mean, there's really no, I mean, the sense of partnership, I think there should be a much stronger sense of partnership between government and industry around these things. And by working together and developing trust and understanding, our objectives in the government sector, in the private sector, and in the public interest sector, I think we actually could like have these kumbaya moments. All it wouldn't be a kumbaya moment, just be a kumbaya institution. So, um, and we face this. I mean, it's from the largest top levels of government down to municipalities where, I mean, I live in a town where where there's a little tiny segment, an interest group that's afraid that 5G is going to make their hair fall out.
Oh gosh.
And I mean, they think your tower burners are like really wonderful people that are pursuing actually the same agenda they have, but just with a slightly different tactic.
Oh,
And
wow.
and it's kind of hilarious, right? They're burning down towers.
I know,
They're not
unbelievable.
burning down small cells. They're burning down towers to protest 5G. Anyway, I shouldn't have gone off on that. It just drives me nuts.
Don't give them ideas.
But yeah, I mean, this is the importance of the concept of the stakeholder rather than the side in a treaty organization. Is that stakeholders just means everybody, right? I mean, we're all stakeholders in this in some way or another. And when it's difficult for us to communicate with, say, our policymakers, our regulators, our elected officials, and it's hard for them to communicate with technologists and with policy experts, then we never really get any trust. Everything we do is driven by suspicion, and like I have to be defended against whatever the other party may do because I fundamentally can't trust them. And I think there are a lot of things that China does that are good. I mean, we don't have to regard everything that China does as horrible just because China did it, although it's not a bad algorithm to start with. Um, but we do have to sort of, I think what we want to do is bring everybody into under the umbrella and identify, the areas of common interest and sort of pursue the greater social good, right? To the extent that that's even possible. Is that what you're saying here, or am I just babbling my own mind?
No, I think you've got it pretty well nailed down there. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about why haven't they taken their new IP proposal to the IETF, which is multi-stakeholder, which does put all stakeholders on equal footing, where we can actually go in and discuss a proposal from China and see what type of technological merit it might have. Because we shouldn't just throw something out, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because it comes from a particular stakeholder.
Mm-hmm.
That wouldn't be fair, that wouldn't be right. But it does matter to have the experts there at the table discussing what's being proposed and really take in the perspectives from everyone, because again, we're not just talking about connecting a telephone in my house to a telephone in your house anymore. We are talking about things that will govern the way that we get to work in the morning, or govern the way that we the maintenance of our water supplies, right? So these are really fundamental technologies that we're now developing and relying on the internet to serve us really basic utilities and services. And so we need to engage those stakeholders. And I think you're absolutely right that that's one of our key takeaways from this, is that we need to be having these discussions in the appropriate forums and engaging the appropriate people.
Great.
I think the other part of the strategy is ensuring, a vacuum has been left and filled by China in the ITU as standards went from multilateral to multi-stakeholder or to other places. Now, the reason standards like for 5G and 4G and all of that went to 3GPP is because industry's there, government's there, a lot of, sort of the ecosystem players, obviously with all their agendas, obviously people seeking, new business contracts and things like that, but everybody's there, right? And at the ITU, you've got a handful of people showing up. And part of the strategy that Stacie and I have discussed just in general is making sure that, study group chairs in the ITU or people are in leadership positions that are from countries that are not just, not just of one country, right? So yeah, making a commitment to have a democracy or a democratic country be in leadership positions, increasingly across the UN is something that is waning in interest for a lot of countries, unfortunately. So from a strategic point of view, it's like thinking about, China has a standard strategy, right? They just had a new standards review, and they have a new report out called the Standards 2035.
Mm-hmm.
And not just for technology, but also for other standards like building standards, environmental standards. Standards is a huge thing on a national level for them, but part of their strategy is looking at where they can run for office, where they can, be the chair of a certain particular working group, where they can do certain things that would be able to influence. And I don't think we've had sort of a coherent discussion about that yet across a number of like-minded governments.
Well, I think we're running out of videotape here, so and the squirrels are hungry. So time to wrap up. Is there any final message you wanna leave the audience with?
It's a good question.
Standards matter.
That's a good one. I like that. Standards, they're probably the most important thing that nobody ever thinks about.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, you look at regulations and there's usually a footnote in there that says, oh, by the way, this means you have to comply with standard XYZ.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. They're that silent foundation that nobody even knows exists. And they don't know they exist. It's a good thing, right?
Well, I mean, it can be quite beneficial because
yeah.
It's supposed to reduce the influence of politics, but yeah, I mean, anybody that thinks technical standards are devoid of politics, it's just politics of a different kind, right? I mean, people always have interests and they always have agendas, and you can usually figure out what they are. Anyway, thanks. I mean, it's been a great discussion. I really, really enjoyed it, and hope to bring you both back. And Stacie, you could, there's a small group that have been on the podcast 3 times, so you can.
I now have a new life ambition.
Yeah, I mean, you keep writing papers like this, and it's not going to be long. I can guarantee you.
I'll keep that in mind.
And Dominique, I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about that would be lots of fun. So there you have it, folks, episode 54 of the High Tech Forum podcast. And so with that, I think I'll bid everyone adieu and see you next time. This is Richard Bennett, High Tech Forum podcast, signing off.